On warm spring afternoons in Portsmouth, the streets usually settled into a familiar rhythm. Parents came home from work. Teenagers drifted in from school. Somewhere between homework, dance, and dinner, life moved exactly the way it had the day before. For one 16-year-old girl, it should have been another ordinary Thursday. Instead, sometime after she got home alone, someone climbed through a window and turned that quiet house into a crime scene. By the time her family found her, Megan Landowski had been bound, sexually assaulted, chased downstairs, and stabbed with such fury that the violence continued even after she was dead. The attack felt personal, intimate, full of rage. Yet the person first suspected was not the one whose DNA was left behind. The truth stayed hidden for months, until a polite teenage boy refused a DNA swab, returned the next day with chewing gum, and made one mistake he could not explain away. This is the murder of Megan Landowski. On the afternoon of April 10, 2008, spring sunlight fell across the quiet streets of Portsmouth, Virginia, a military town where families live close together and most people believe they knew their neighbors. Behind the doors of tidy homes and along tree-lined roads near the water, daily life moved with a calm rhythm of school, work, and routine. It was the kind of place where children rode buses home, parents returned from duty stations, and the worst horrors always seemed far away. That illusion ended inside a house on Roberts Court, where 16-year-old Megan Landowski was found murdered on her kitchen floor. Portsmouth sat along the Chesapeake Bay, shaped by the presence of the Navy, the Coast Guard, and generations of families who had built their lives there. It was a town of uniforms, shipyards, churches, and familiar faces. Chris Short, a Navy petty officer first class, had recently settled there with his wife Angela and their children after a transfer from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to Portsmouth Naval Hospital. Their home life carried the usual mix of structure and teenage chaos. Their oldest daughter, Megan Landowski, was bright, social, and impossible to overlook. She loved clothes, hair, and nail polish, and boys. She had the energy and confidence of a girl, just beginning to imagine the life she wanted. Megan had one passion that stood above the rest: dance. After moving back to the United States, she finally had access to serious training, and she threw herself into it. On stage and in class, she had the kind of presence that made people stop talking and watch. At school, she was friendly and warm, the sort of teenager who drew others in easily. She seemed like the girl next door in the most literal sense. Pretty, talented, approachable, and full of life. Nothing about her world suggested it was moving toward violence. That Thursday began like any other. Angela woke Megan for school, talked with her about a test she had that day, and drove her to Woodrow Wilson High School. Before Megan got out of the car, her mother told her to call when she got home. Megan said she would. It was a simple exchange, the kind family forget as soon as it happens. At the time, there was no reason to believe it would become the last ordinary moment they would ever share. Later that afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Chris Short pulled into the driveway. The front door was open. It immediately felt wrong. Megan had been warned many times not to leave the house open when she was alone. He called her name and got no answer. Then he saw her. Megan was lying on the floor, still with her eyes open. In a single second, the ordinary shape of his home turned into the scene of a nightmare. Inside the house, the violence was overwhelming. Megan had been stabbed repeatedly in the back, neck, face, chest, and throat. Clear packaging tape had been wrapped over her mouth, and her arms had been bound. Blood covered the kitchen floor and splattered the refrigerator, stove, counters, and walls. A knife from the kitchen block lay in the sink. Upstairs, the bedroom told the earlier part of the story. The bed was disturbed from a struggle. A tape dispenser had been left near the bed. Seminal fluid was found on the bedding and in Megan's underwear. Before she was killed, she had been sexually assaulted. The attack had unfolded in 2 stages. The killer came in through a first-floor window, moved through the house, confronted Megan upstairs, and bound her. At some point, she fought back. She broke free and ran downstairs toward the kitchen. He followed her, grabbed a knife, and stabbed her again and again until she collapsed. Even after she was dead, the attack continued. 12 of the stab wounds were inflicted after death. The wounds were not just fatal. They were personal, furious, deliberate, Whoever killed Megan Landowski was not acting in panic. He was expressing rage. The murder stunned Portsmouth. A teenage girl had been sexually assaulted and butchered in broad daylight inside her own home. The killer had entered a suburban house, committed an act of extreme violence, and vanished without being seen. Parents looked at their own daughters differently. Teenagers who had never known real fear suddenly understood that terrible things could happen close to home. In a town built around order and routine, the crime felt like a breach in reality. Very early in the case, one possible answer seemed obvious. Only months before the murder, Megan had reported sexual abuse by Keith Camp, a Navy friend of Chris Short. Megan had described inappropriate contact that began with kissing and escalated into sexual advances. Charges had been filed. A trial was pending. Without Megan's testimony, that case could not move forward. The timing was impossible to ignore. A grown man facing criminal consequences from a teenage accuser suddenly had a reason to want her silenced. Keith Camp became the first major suspect. His home was searched. His computer was examined. Deleted material led to child pornography, which deepened suspicion and cast a darker shadow over his behavior. He denied any role in Megan's death and claimed he had been on base the entire day. At first, the alibi did not seem strong enough to eliminate him, but when the timeline was tested, it did not work. The travel window was too narrow. The people around him accounted for his movements. Then the most important result arrived. DNA from the crime scene did not match Keith Camp. However disturbing his history was, he was not the person who killed Megan Landowski. With Keith Camp ruled out, the case opened back up into something far more frightening. The family had been cleared. Chris Short's DNA did not match. Angela and Megan's siblings were eliminated. The obvious suspects were gone. The person who had entered through the window and left that house soaked in violence was someone else entirely. The nature of the wounds offered one clue. The attack looked personal. Megan had not been killed quickly. She had been dominated, assaulted, pursued, and overkilled. That kind of rage often grows from obsession, humiliation, or rejection. So the focus shifted to Megan's own world. Her friends, her crushes, her routines, her private life at school. To the adults around her, Megan was a teenage girl with a busy schedule and a wide social circle. To her friends, she was funny, pretty, social, and always talking about school, dance, grades, and boys. But teenage life is often invisible to parents, and detectives soon began looking at the parts of Megan's world that adults might never see. They spoke to students at Woodrow Wilson High School, looked into the boys she liked, and followed the small emotional currents that define adolescent life. A string of crushes and short-lived interests surfaced, but none of the boys stood out. They were interviewed, tested, and ruled out. Rumors also began to circulate. Some students believed Megan had been afraid to go home. Others repeated that something had been bothering her. But once those stories were traced back, they collapsed into teenage exaggeration. Megan had not been scared to return to her house. She simply did not like being home alone and preferred being with friends. The rumor had spread because one teenager passed along a small detail, and others reshaped it into something more dramatic. The investigation widened again. Megan had been active online. Social networking profiles, screen names, and digital conversations were checked for hidden contacts, threats, or arguments. Nothing pointed to a predator from the internet. No one unusual appeared in her messages. No secret online relationship led to the house on Roberts Court. Another path ended with nothing. Months passed. The case remained unsolved. Megan's family grieved through the numbness of spring and the heat of summer, then approached what would have been her 17th birthday without answers. The brutality of the murder stayed fresh because it had never been explained. The killer was still somewhere in the same city, living among ordinary people, passing unnoticed through ordinary days. Then a lab result changed the direction of the search. Biogeographic DNA testing suggested the unknown male was African American. It was not a perfect science and not enough on its own, but it narrowed a field that mattered in a case that had slowly expanded into dozens of interviews and dead ends. The investigation had begun with broad uncertainty. Now it had at least one sharper line to follow. A concerned local resident provided the next break. The name that emerged was not from Woodrow Wilson High School, where most of the student interviews had focused. It came from Megan's earlier time in a performing arts program at Chuchland High School. She had attended that program for dance before returning to Wilson. There, she had known a quiet violin student named Robert Barnes. Robert Barnes was 17 years old. He was polite, accomplished, and outwardly harmless. He did well in school. He had no serious trouble in his background. Megan referred to him as Bobby and considered him a friend. She had noticed that he might like her as more than that, but she did not return those feelings. To most people, he seemed like a respectful, gifted teenager, the kind of boy nobody would fear. When Robert Barnes was interviewed, he spoke about Megan the same way many others had. He called her sweet. He described her as nice. He gave nothing away in his words. But something in the encounter felt off. At the end of the interview, he was asked for a DNA sample, just as other boys had been. He refused. He suggested his mother would not approve, though at 17, he did not need parental consent. The refusal alone did not prove guilt, but it set him apart immediately. Everyone else had cooperated. The next day, Robert Barnes reached out again. This time, he offered a piece of chewing gum instead of a formal swab. He had been chewing it when he handed it over. On the surface, it looked like a change of heart. In reality, it was a trick. The DNA on the gum came back as female. He had switched the sample. That act changed everything. An innocent teenager might feel nervous. He might hesitate. He might even refuse. But boy who tried to outsmart the test by planting someone else's DNA was doing something very different. He was not avoiding involvement. He was manipulating evidence. Robert Barnes was brought back in. He was confronted about the false sample. He began talking, trying to stay ahead of the evidence, and in the process he revealed something he should not have known. He referred to murder as having happened on a Thursday. That detail had not been shared with the people interviewed up to that point. In that moment, the hidden shape of the case came into view. Robert Barnes was not a polite music student caught in unfortunate suspicion. He was the one who had been inside the house. Then came the story he invented to save himself. He claimed Megan had invited him over. He said that when he entered the house, a masked gunman was already there holding her at gunpoint. He described being forced to tie Megan up, tape her, and commit a sexual act on her while under threat. He said the masked man then led them downstairs, grabbed a knife, stabbed Megan, and cut his finger in order to leave drops of blood. In his version of events, he was not the attacker. He was a terrified witness trapped by a phantom. The story collapsed under its own weight. It was wildly specific where it needed to explain the evidence, and absurd where it needed to shift blame. The crime scene showed one offender. The fantasy gunman existed only to carry the burden Robert Barnes could no longer hide. By trying to account for every piece of evidence, he exposed how much he knew. He was not describing a murder he had stumbled into. He was reliving one he had committed. Robert Barnes was arrested for the murder of Megan Landowski. The revelation shocked Megan's family and the wider community. For months, people had imagined an older predator, a hardened criminal, a stranger moving through the neighborhood. Instead, the killer was a teenage boy who had spoken politely to adults, ridden the bus, attended school, and blended easily into ordinary life. His age made the crime feel even more disturbing. The violence inside that house had seemed too savage, too relentless, too cold to come from someone still in high school. But it had. The reconstruction of crime became painfully clear. On April 10th, 2008, Robert Barnes entered the short home through a first-floor window while Megan was alone. His presence likely surprised her at first rather than alarmed her. She knew who he was. That familiarity gave him his opening. He took her upstairs, bound her with tape, and sexually assaulted her. Whether he had planned the attack in full, or whether fantasy turned to violence in the moment, the result was the same. Megan fought him. She broke free and ran downstairs. That act of resistance shaped the final minutes of her life. Robert chased her into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and began stabbing. The wounds to her neck and chest were direct killing blows. The wounds to her face, and I carried anger and humiliation. The post-mortem stabbing showed a loss of control, so complete that even death did not stop him. Afterward, he left the house and returned to ordinary life. carrying the secret while Megan's family and the city around him suffered through months of uncertainty. The motive was never fully explained by Robert Barnes in his own words, but the pattern was unmistakable. He had feelings for Megan that were not returned. He lived in the gap between the person he appeared to be and the person he truly was. To the outside world, he was talented, respectful, and calm. Inside, resentment and obsession had been growing. Megan's rejection became something he could not accept. He wanted access, control, and submission. When he could not have what he wanted, desire became rage. In September 2009, Robert Barnes pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated sexual battery. He was sentenced to 42 years in prison. The plea ended the legal case, but it did not answer every question. It did not restore what was taken from Megan or erase the terror of what happened inside her home. It simply fixed one truth in place forever. The boy who entered through that window would never again be free to do to someone else what he did to her. For Angela and Chris Short, the outcome brought a form of closure, but not peace in the simple sense. Keith Camp would never face trial for what he had done to Megan because she was no longer alive to testify. The family at first believed that danger came from the adult who had already crossed a line with her. Instead, the final threat came from a teenage boy who had moved through her world almost invisibly. That twist made the loss feel even crueler. Megan had survived one violation only to die resisting another. There was one truth that remained stronger than the uncertainty around motive. Megan fought. She fought upstairs. She fought to get free. She ran. She resisted until the very end. In that resistance was the final shape of her character. She was not passive. She was not broken easily. The violence done to her was real and devastating, but so was her refusal to surrender quietly to it. Portsmouth slowly returned to its routines. Students at Woodrow Wilson High School went back to classes, dances, friendships, and gossip. Parents resumed the endless cycle of carpools, dinners, and school mornings. But the town was not the same. Megan Landowski's murder left behind a permanent fracture in the sense of safety people once took for granted. Teenagers who had believed horror belonged to television understood now that it could live nearby, behind a familiar face, inside someone they had brushed past in a hallway. That may have been the darkest part of the case. Robert Barnes was not a monster who looked like one. He did not arrive from outside the community, wearing danger on his face. He was a boy people thought they knew. He carried talent, manners, and apparent innocence like a disguise. Behind it was obsession, humiliation, and a capacity for violence that stayed hidden until exploded. Megan Landowski never came home from school that day. She never made the phone call her mother expected. Her dance classes ended. Her future stopped. And the small, ordinary promises of family life, the ride to school, the reminder to call, the belief that home is the safest place in the world, were shattered in a single afternoon. In the years that followed, her name remained tied to that terrible lesson. You can live on a quiet street in a town full of uniforms and families. You can believe danger has a certain face, a certain age, a certain history. You can believe you would recognize it if it stood near you. And still, the person capable of the worst kind of violence may already be there, smiling politely, waiting for the moment nobody is looking. That was the truth hidden inside the murder of Megan Landowski. A girl loved by her family, admired by her friends, and full of promise was targeted by someone who could not accept that she did not belong to him. He entered her home, attacked her, and tried to erase her future. Instead, he exposed his own, and in the silence left behind, Portsmouth learned that evil does not always arrive as a stranger. Sometimes it grows quietly behind an ordinary face, until one day it steps across the threshold and changes everything.